Even though I was a fan of the Sega Saturn, I was no stranger to the library of the Sony PlayStation. Because of that console's immense popularity, it was so much easier playing games there because everyone and their granddad had one of the things. Whether it was family, co-workers, neighbors, or whatever, PlayStation games were readily available to rent, borrow, trade, buy, and sell in mass quantities. Of course, all of that was bolstered by the huge library it had. Thanks to its impressive sales numbers, the PlayStation received over 4,000 games worldwide, a number that at the time dwarfed its competition. Among that number were timeless classics that made this system one of the very best ever. No exaggeration, you could make a top 200 for the PlayStation and still miss 100 games that absolutely deserve to be there. But among that list of classics, there stirred some games that were just awful. Games so terrible that you could tell the developers just wanted something out there to make a quick buck. And if I wanted to do a worst of list, the PlayStation has some entries to rival the Atari Jaguar itself. But I'm not doing a worst of list here. I'm doing another video on games that let me down because I had genuine interest in them. Just like my recent Nintendo 64 video, I have chosen a group of titles that failed to live up to my expectations. Again, not all of these games were necessarily bad, they just did not turn out the way I wanted or expected. I have 15 picks for you, so let's get started. Believe it or not, there was a time when the idea of a Star Wars one-on-one fighter held some serious promise. When Star Wars Masters of Teras, or whatever the hell it's called, came along, man, I had visions of lightsaber duels, vicious force powers, and an arsenal of alien weapons to counter it all. There is no question the core setup held promise. The characters were from movies and books you knew and loved, and the presentation made it feel like it was fully of that beloved universe. But it got a lot wrong with the gameplay. Some pretty important things like balance, responsive control, and timing. The core mechanics themselves aren't bad, but the game isn't paced well at all, and the character imbalance is unreal. Don't get me wrong, it's fun for a few minutes unleashing the lightsabers on the rest of the cast, but these powers trump everything else to the point where nothing else is worth trying. You have two forms of combat with and without your weapon, but the unarmed stuff feels so incredibly simple and boring in comparison. The terrible thing is you get a small glimpse of what a Star Wars fighter could be here, but unfortunately, LucasArts never made a sequel or follow-up to improve upon it. It's the type of game some people hate with a passion, and it's really easy to see why. This gameplay needed some help, and mostly leaves you wanting more than it ever gives you.
Knockout. You win. I'm ready.
In the early days of the PlayStation, the Extreme Games series was actually pretty fun for what they were. It took things like cycling, skateboarding, and rollerblading and added an extreme sports angle to them that was quite playable. But when 3 Extreme came along, they went with a fully polygonal engine, and that didn't feel the same, and they made the courses way the hell too long. On top of those issues, the series failed to really evolve over the course of 4 years, leaving you with a been there and done that feeling. It got old quick and offered nothing over the previous entries. This needed new modes like snowboarding, jet skiing, or maybe bringing back the street luge from the first one. The idea needed more variants to feel new and different, and really expand into the other areas of extreme sporting events. There were all sorts of options to add that was needed to bring the series back into relevance. Instead, it retread already familiar ground and felt like a quick and dirty throw together of ideas that has sold well for Sony before. In the end, I'd rather play the first or second one, where they were much cheaper when this one was released. Alien Trilogy was a fairly well-made first-person shooter during the 32-bit era. When the next game showed up in 2000 called Alien Resurrection, I figured it had to be a big improvement. Based on the 1997 film, this PlayStation exclusive endured a torturous 4 years of development that saw it go from an overhead shooter to a Tomb Raider clone to its final form here as a first-person shooter. I don't mind telling you that much of the game design here is really interesting. The game nails the atmosphere of this universe perfectly, and the sound is a huge part of that experience. The levels are done well, the objectives sensible, and I dare say it's far more interesting than the movie on which it's based. But all that is nearly ruined by the game's brutal difficulty and lackluster combat. Items and ammo are scarce, enemies do crazy damage, and they come at you from every angle, every nook, and every passage you've already explored. It's very similar in feel to a survival horror experience, but you rarely get any respite from the enemy onslaught. This takes a game that could have been something special and turns it into a controller-throwing nightmare of constant deaths. It's just so poorly balanced that it'll leave you screaming at the TV and cursing the developers. Make no mistake, if you value presentation and have the patience of a monk, this game can be a hidden gem. I wanted to be that person, but in the end, I had to walk away to save my console from being tossed out the window. An interesting point you may not know is that Alien Resurrection here was one of the first PlayStation games to use the right analog stick to look around and aim during combat. It also supports the mouse. The Contra series from Konami was once revered for its incredible quality. Among the run-and-gun greats, it sat atop the mountain for all others to be envious. When the series started being developed by a Western developer called Appaloosa Interactive, quality took a massive hit. At first there was Legacy of War, a top-down run-and-gun that wasn't all that great, but for all its problems, the follow-up called See the Contra Adventure was far worse. This time it uses different viewpoints for its run-and-gun action. You get third-person fully 3D stages, you get side-scrolling 2.5D stuff, and the rest are overhead and corridor-based affairs. If things had stayed just 2.5D, this would have been tolerable and an acceptable addition to the franchise. But no, it just had to have 3D in it, and boy do those stages suck. The third-person stages are the worst. A mix of bad platforming, imprecise weapon fire, and a jerky camera. The overhead gameplay is just straight dull and offers nothing even close to the fun of the Nintendo or Super Nintendo games that offered similar viewpoints. I don't know what the hell the developers and their quality control were thinking. They had the side-scrolling stages that could have been locked down, expanded, and made the best they could be. Instead it tried to do too much, accomplished too little, and gave us a Contra game unworthy of that name. Driver 2 was a 2000 sequel to a very interesting game. This time you have some big upgrades in place like being able to switch cars, run around on foot, and a 2-player mode. But as much as I wanted to like this, it all falls apart thanks to shoddy polygon pop-in, sluggish performance, and completely unbalanced design. The original had a hell of a learning curve, and this one is made so much worse by the way it looks, runs, and is paced. The opening of the first prepared you for that game's difficulty, but here, you are thrown into somewhat easy missions that turns crazy hard out of the blue. It's terribly irritating to fail a mission instantly because you are too far away from your target. Because of the way it runs and is paced, Every issue the first game had is accentuated here, making it a tough one to love if you were a fan of the original. They also added more of the things I didn't enjoy about the first, like more story cinematics, instant fail missions, and following cars around. Driver 2 isn't terrible, mind you, but the fun of the first game was running from the cops and the cool stuff you could do with your car. That should have been refined and made even better in the sequel. Instead, it's worse, and that's a shame when the expectations were so high. I was a kid of the 80s, so a show like the Dukes of Hazzard was a big hit with me. When the game showed up for the PlayStation, I figured it would be all jumps, races, and half-naked women. I wasn't going to take it seriously, of course, but I was still shocked at how much this game missed the mark. The cutscenes and story are the stuff of nightmares, it doesn't look good, and the gameplay feels like the General Lee is trying to evade the Terminator half the time. No kidding. These cops are unstoppable, which makes the ridiculous physics model stick out even more. While the speed is solid, the mechanics themselves feel overly sloppy and twitchy. This really impacts the thrill of running from Roscoe and his merry band of police officers, and the rest of the bad guys you'll encounter. It's tolerable during the easier missions, but the late game loses all steam because of it. Couple that with the previously mentioned awful story and character representation, and it makes playing this one for any length of time rough. A game like this should have been all about the thrill of driving this iconic car around stages that looked and ran great, a super simple story, and missions with a ton of variety. It misses the mark pretty much everywhere. Some of you wondered why I didn't add WCW Nitro to my Nintendo 64 letdown list. Well, that's because I played it on the PlayStation first. This one was developed by Inland Productions for THQ, and it's a mess in every category. The graphics and animation are terrible, the way too fast gameplay is grossly unrealistic, the limited roster, the lack of match types, and the in-fight music is irritating. Good God, who was this made for? These wrestlers are like a bunch of coked up hamsters running around the ring. Nothing slows any of them down. Nothing stops them until a pinfall. Chair shot, brainbuster, powerbomb, even the concrete. None of it matters. Everyone is right back up like nothing happened only a few seconds later, unless they have low life. I really hate the way it bypasses the traditional lockup mechanic and allows you to just pull off moves out of the blue with various button combinations. This makes things simultaneously too easy and too hard. You can just spam the same simple moves, kick them when they're down, and then get the easy win, over and over. This can also happen to you, while you're trying the more complicated moves and finishers. In other words, every damn thing feels off, is no fun, or flies in the face of everything that makes a good wrestling game. It's as crappy as these games can get. Unbelievably, the garbage that was WCW Nitro sold well enough to justify a sequel, the even worse WCW NWO Thunder. I went into this one thinking it absolutely had to be an improvement over the previous release, and boy was that expecting too much. Making a return is our cast of coked up hamsters who have now discovered meth for an even more erratic display of unrealistic animation that is way the heck too fast. Seriously, it's like you have the speed set to the video times 2, but this is actually how this garbage runs. That awful fighting game style move input is back and requires you to be as exact as ever with your timing. They do add a tie-up feature this time, for more moves per wrestler, but it's a shallow upgrade that doesn't really help much. Once you get tired of that, you'll resort to the same one or two moves over and over that zap your opponent's life and lead to an easy win. The roster is a bit larger than Nitro's, and the stupid unlockables make a return. The developers must have loved the smell of their own farts because they essentially just remade Nitro using the theme of a different show. I went into Nitro not knowing what to expect and being severely disappointed. I went into Thunder here hoping there would be some improvements and got absolutely none. That left me ashamed I was fooled twice by Inland Productions and THQ, leading me to hate this one even more. Dumpster fire is far too polite a phrase for this god-awful series. The first Doom release on the PlayStation had been great. It ran well enough, had some great atmospheric sounds, and the lighting was cool. When Final Doom released, I thought we were gonna get an even better game full of new content. The presentation was there, but there was a huge gaping issue that I couldn't overlook. The PlayStation version here has a massive amount of missing content, ranging from many of the stages, bosses, and enemy layouts. Console Doom versions always had changes, but this was just straight false advertisement. This was not Final Doom. This was a tiny piece of Final Doom that was missing most of the best parts. To add insult to injury, it also seemed to run worse at times than the previous game on the PlayStation, a reality that shouldn't have been the case if the developers had been shooting for genuine improvements to that engine. You could forgive the changes and differences to the first Doom on the PlayStation because it was released in 1995, but that game had so much more content. Final Doom here only has 30 stages, compared to the 64 of the original PC version, and the 58 in the first PlayStation Doom. This should have been a budget $20 expansion at best, and the people involved at Williams should all feel bad for stealing your money. I was late to the Harry Potter universe, not knowing anything about it until the first movie landed in 2001. I loved what I saw and was interested in the video game released for the PlayStation. I don't want to hate on this one too awful much because it really isn't that bad of a game, but Electronic Arts really narrowed its audience big time. There's lots of collecting, platforming, exploration, and it doesn't look bad at all. What's wrong with it is that I wanted something that wasn't aimed at an 8-year-old. This game is extremely simple in every way. I realized that the book and the movie had a large younger audience, but it also appealed to older kids and adults as well. This one easily could have been scaled with difficulty levels to give some deeper gameplay and objectives a chance to shine. Nintendo does this all the time with their games. Instead, I fired it up and was met with software that was way too simple, too easy, and too focused on a few mediocre gameplay hooks. It's one of those games that jumps and grabs for you, taking what little challenge it does have away. Taking myself out of the equation, this ain't bad for youngsters. Outside of the crappy camera views you sometimes get stuck with. I also really dislike the fact that there was no music during much of the gameplay. In 1997, Acclaim released a light gun shooter in the arcade based on the Judge Dredd comic book. I never played it there, and when it was released for the PlayStation, I thought it'd be worth a try. Cue the dramatic music, because this turd was one of the worst gun games I've ever seen. It's a bit like Area 51 in Maximum Force, where the environment is completely video. You move along a predetermined path shooting bad guys as they pop out, along with gun placements that literally pop out of every monitor, column, train, window, elevator, and every other thing in the environment. When you have games like Point Blank and Time Crisis to contend with, however, you better have something deeper than this. The graphics are unimpressive and jittery, the action one-note and boring, the hit detection terrible, and perhaps worst of all, it's a laughable portrayal of the character and universe. Area 51 and Maximum Force already did this game so much better, so if you're going to emulate that game type, why not copy it all the way? To give you an idea of how bad this was, GameFan, the most forgiving and overrating magazine in existence, hated on it. And if they hated it, you know it had to suck. NFL GameDay and GameDay 97 were very fun games. I was stoked for GameDay 98 thanks to the new polygon players and the extremely high review scores in the gaming magazines. The joke was on me because I hated this one to the core. Nothing about the new visuals appealed to me. I thought the players looked awful and the animation seemed to be unnatural and glitchy. The gameplay had a bunch of things I disliked, like players that would get knocked down for far too long, grotesquely overpowered players, and a passing game that felt like you were throwing a baseball instead of a football. The AI was also all over the place in terms of effectiveness. Sports games always have money plays, but this AI would punish certain plays like a boss and give up money plays on others like they weren't even on the field. I realize I'm in the small minority here because this game is almost universally loved, but I preferred the previous games tenfold over this one and the ones that followed it. Funnily enough, the gameplay series didn't change a lot in the following years, but the review scores got worse and worse. It kinda makes me feel like this game was overrated, and people finally started to see it.
4th and 10 on the 20-yard line.
47, green 22.
The field goal is good. The Cowboys 3, the 49ers nothing.
Once upon a time, the name Core Design carried with it some pride and quality. Not so with 1998's Ninja Shadow of Darkness. How in the heck do you mess up a beat-em-up with ninjas? There's swords, stars, and even ninja magic. Mess it up they did because this couldn't have been much worse. From the shallow and imprecise mechanics to the laughably simple visuals and absurd animations, Ninja falls apart from the moment you hit the start button. Aside from the awful hit detection and aggressive enemies, there are also traps constantly eating up a third of your life frequently. It makes an already challenging game ridiculously difficult. Core had just come off Tomb Raider with this game, so why they didn't use that engine is a hell of a head scratcher. This would have benefited from a slower and more measured pace. The viewpoint you do get is ineffective and feels separated from your character. All of that is secondary to the terrible combat, however. You are beset upon by many enemies and have damage coming your way from every direction. A lot of it you never see coming. It makes this frustrating from the get-go and something I genuinely can't stand for more than 10 minutes. Tell you the truth, it feels a bit like the inspiration that would eventually lead to Fighting Force. A Sega Saturn version of this one was almost completed, but got cancelled despite being the lead platform. Lucky us, because this is one of the cheapest games from a decent developer I've ever played. The original Loaded was a personal favorite in the run and gun genre, but when the sequel Reloaded appeared, I was completely underwhelmed. The original game had been a love letter to those of us that loved wanton carnage and destruction. The fun was powering up and laying waste to hordes of enemies with various weapon types. Reloaded comes along and tries to add deeper meaning to it all, with puzzles, larger multi-part stages, new objectives, and environments that are more challenging to negotiate. All that does not make it a better experience, however. Instead of just adding more weapons, more stuff to destroy, and bigger explosions, the new design actually slows the action down and makes getting through the stages frustrating. Because there is a heavy emphasis on ground that can and can't be climbed up, it's easy to get stuck and not know where to go. Honestly, it's a real shame because the developers missed the point of why the first game succeeded entirely. It was about mental patience laying waste to everything the eye could see in a bid to win their freedom. Trying to please the detractors of that style of game was not the way to go for the sequel. They were never going to see it as anything more than a shallow blastathon anyway. Reloaded should have doubled down on its violence and depravity and gave us more of it. I love the early Twisted Metal games so much, but by the time we got to Small Brawl here, things had gone horribly wrong. There had always been a sort of sadistic nature to the series, so why they wanted to make this cutesy version is completely lost on me. Here you use RC vehicles to battle it out across cliched residential settings. The graphics aren't good, the psychotic charm of the series is utterly destroyed, and nothing new is really added to the gameplay to compensate for it all. It's too slow, too tame, and too cute for fans of the series to care. A big issue here are the tiny stages you now battle in. Before you had entire areas to explore, but that's been replaced by tiny rooms that just aren't the same. That leaves this one for younger kids, and there are much better racing and combat options even for them. It wasn't the worst way to end the series, but it also wasn't the best. Things had started so strong on the PlayStation, but never felt like they grew or evolved in any way. I would have much rather have had a dialed back port of Twisted Metal Black than this gimmicky cop-out. Even the official PlayStation magazine hated on it, which should really tell you all you need to know. Like my last video, some of these are likely to land quite differently for some of you. If that's the case, relax. This isn't a worst of video, and nobody is saying you are wrong for feeling any different. But for me, these games just didn't live up to my expectations back then, and even capturing footage for them today, I was quickly reminded why. I had actually hoped some of them would change my mind after all these years, but I came away once again feeling a sense of profound disappointment that I couldn't connect with them. Just like my Nintendo 64 list, there were also many more PlayStation games I could add for a part 2. So if any of that interests you, let me know down in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.